Okay, we are live. It is Thursday afternoon, and we are here to talk about the Budget Adjustment Act. And I invited some folks that we've already heard before, along with, which is Gus Seelig and Polly Major from VHCD. I invited Chris Donnelly to come in and to talk about the fact that in the Budget Adjustment Act, there's no extra money scheduled to be reallocated for housing. And one of the things that Gus mentioned in passing, we heard some of it this morning as well, and is that there's, without having the money in the BAA, it sends a message to developers that the money is what's been expended is what's been expended, and there's no more, and then you have to wait until July, until after the big budget's passed. And it's gonna stop the momentum that's been in place. And so there was a request. There's been a couple of different requests for us to address that issue in the Budget Adjustment Act. The Budget Adjustment Act that we reviewed yesterday is the administration's proposal. All financial budgets start in the House. So there are recommendations from the administration. And we are just going to take this time now to talk about should we advise the Appropriations Committee to, at the very least, consider adding money to housing in any direction. Now, it's coincidental that the housing organizations, and Chris, can you join us? Issued a release last year where the housing organizations put their request out loud. And just want to, first of all, I want to introduce Chris. We'll hear more about Champlain Housing Trust next week. But Chris was at least were you the author of the press release or the sender?
Yeah, Chris Donnelly with the Champlain Housing Trust, for the record. It was a joint statement from 10 or so different housing organizations.
So I just
I'm the one that hit send on the.
Right, that's how it came. That's how it came on into my computer and phone and iPad. So I guess so Chris is, again, we'll go into detail what Champlain Housing Trust does, but Champlain Housing Trust is the Champlain, or is the Chittenden County and Franklin County affordable housing.
In Grand Isle.
Yep. And NeighborWorks organization, and you've heard of them throughout the testimony. But Chris, if you could just spend a few minutes kind of outlining, it was a big ask during a period of time where there is surplus money that will get spent in people's minds 5 different ways between now and the time we finish our budget. But if you could just draw out the sketch for our committee about what the housing community's vision of and why it would need more money now, that would be appreciated.
Sure, and thank you for having me. So it is a big ask, and I know there are a lot of other big asks of the legislature this year. And actually, within the $175 million request, there's many different things that we would like to accomplish, ranging from helping get people out of motels into permanent housing, all the way to more access to home ownership. And I believe that there will be lots of opportunity and robust conversation in this committee as well as others to discuss how we should carve up that money, what those priorities are, what you want to see moving forward as we create permanent housing options for people. There are lots of other programs that are out there that are oversubscribed as well, things like a farm worker housing loan program that we started up with VHCB support last year. We've already spent the money allocated to that. So So within the larger $175 million request that we put out, there are lots of different priorities that we can accomplish. And I think, budgets and spending are an expression of not just the priorities, but your values. And we know that housing is something that all of you heard of a lot about when you were running for office and what your constituents were hoping that you would come here to do. When I looked at the budget adjustment, I didn't see housing as a value represented in that. And so I know the housing organizations would like to see additional money in the Budget Adjustment Act for housing development. The VHIP program was in there. I think you've heard about the VHIP program, the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, which is great. It's $5 million in there. But as the chair mentioned, there are viable projects. There's building that we want to do that we have in our pipeline. And having the signal now and having the resources available soon to help move those projects along will go a long way for us to be able to continue to bring those projects forward. I know that I have colleagues this afternoon, probably as I speak, testifying. I'm thinking so because my phone is buzzing. Testifying in the public hearing downstairs on the budget adjustments, describing specific projects that they're bringing forward to VHCB, and they're not sure that the resources are going to be there in May and June. So encouraging us to continue to do this work that I know your constituents have asked you to come here to do, and we deliver that in your communities would be appreciated. Happy to talk specifics, but we're hoping that in the budget adjustment that there could be $50 million set aside to continue the development pipeline of affordable housing in the state.
Well, can you be specific about maybe not down to the street address, but could you give an idea of what type of programs would be funded with this extra money during this, in this adjustment?
One of my colleagues at Cathedral Square said that they're developing 33 apartments in St. Albans, senior housing, that they have a request that's going to VHCB. They are hoping that gets funded. That's not for certain. I have a colleague, I think Robert Little was here from Rural Edge this morning. They have a project that they want to move forward. He's talking about that downstairs as well. I know at the Champlain Housing Trust, we work in Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Island County. We have 800 or so homes of all types in our pipeline that we want to move forward on, one of which is in the center of the largest city in the state, which people affectionately call the Pit, in the middle of Burlington, that we have 88 or so, 85 apartments that we want to build there as part of a much larger development. That won't all get funded this year. That will need extra dollars. So there's projects all across the state. You have signaled as a legislature that housing is a priority, and your community partners have brought forth viable projects. And there are not resources currently available to fund those.
And would you envision, we need to hear from eventually, where this money would come from. This is usually, but not solely, general fund money. The last couple of years, it's been reallocation of some of the federal funds, but this sounds like to me that the Budget Adjustment Act is about the general fund dollars. So $50 million, if it were spent the way that the ARPA money was used, and based on your experience, CHT spent $20 million on the hotel on 2A, is that right?
Williston, yeah.
In Williston, which purchased how many units that had to be recycled?
There's 72.
Just 72.
The 72 apartments, that was some federal tax credit program. This is not all state money went into that. So there's a combination of ARPA and state funds that went into that, plus federal source.
Right, and so what would $20 million do under the conventional, if it were just all money that could go to 9% deals, or, how would that get, again, I'm just trying to get an idea of like, that, one project cost $20 million and it was 70 some odd units, and it's gonna be ready a lot faster than some of the conventional projects. But what do you see in terms of the difference in use of the money for this? And I mean, you listed off some separate projects. I'm just trying to figure out, does that add up better than using the ARPA dollars faster? Are we're creating more units with this money?
I wouldn't say that for sure, because it's really dependent on the other sources of funding that would fill in the gaps. And, you've heard a little bit about the federal tax credits last week. There's some that are very limited that are also very, very valuable. So there's only so much we can accomplish using those credits. And then the more you will use the less valuable credits, the 4% credits, the more state funds or ARPA funds we would have to add to it. So it's really going to depend on, but when I look at the last few years of projects that we've moved through, we look at maybe 150 to 200,000 of state funds per unit that we develop. So, but that's a mixture of different projects that have a mixture of different funding sources. So just on an average. So we could do the math on that pretty soon. I don't know if I want to do that right here in my head, but we can do that.
Questions for Chris, Representative Labonte?
Just for clarification, 175 million,
Yes.
is that for the statewide or just for?
Statewide.
Okay, thank you.
Statewide. And for a range of programs. And that's what we're thinking is what we're asking for in the combination of the budget adjustment and in the big bill.
Thank you.
So the big bill, if there were 50 million in BAA, the big bill would be different. It wouldn't be 175. It would be, or start at 125 would be an expectation.
So, right, and then there's another 5 in the BAA for the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, VHIP program.
Right.
So we get a jump start on that 175.
Last year in the BAA, when we went through this same exercise, I believe we put in conjunction with the administration and with the Senate, $55 million, which was split. Is that right?
Split between general and ARPA dollars, and I forget if it's 30 of one and 25. It's 35 and 20. I forget which one was which, but.
And any other questions right now, Representative Howard?
I'm sure you're aware that in Rutland, the Housing Trust is looking to refurbish the buildings at College of St. Joseph's.
Right.
And we're very excited about that. I also was told that there is a possibility of building on off of Forest Street. There's open land there for building some homes similar to what we have across the street from there, called Hickory Place.
Yeah.
But I understand that won't happen for at least 3 years.
It does. Real estate development takes time, and so it starts with ideas, and but soon after the ideas, we need to have an idea that there's going to be some resources, because it's hard to take that risk without knowing that the resources would be available for it.
Well, we're very anxious to have that piece of property at College of St. Joseph's, put to good use. And like I said, we're very excited and very pleased about this project that Housing Trust of Rutland.
Yep. Great.
Thank you.
Would you classify that as a pipeline project? Something that gets identified and then starts going through the process, but the expectation is 3 years to get.
Certainly the Forest Street one, I would call that, I don't know where they're at with the College of St. Joseph's. I'm not sure, I'm just not familiar with where they're at in the process, but
Because that's a question that, whether it's the media or people who aren't clear on how the system works, they've hooked onto the word. Is it a pipe, what's the pipeline like?
Right.
And pipeline is not equivalent to shovel ready, which was another recession area
Yep.
phrase.
Yep.
Representative Chestnut Tangent.
So thinking about just all the different places where the different aspects of housing, the different places money needs to go, and looking at the balancing the immediate need for shelter and the ending of the hotel voucher program, unless if money's put into that as well. And VHIP being sounds like a very cost-effective program, but ultimately there is a limited number of built units to be brought back. And the end game has to be new development. So I think, I'm supportive of continuing robust funding for the end game. Yeah.
I heard, I read this earlier this week that the estimate now is by 2030, we need 40,000 new homes in Vermont if we want to meet our goals, meet our housing goals. And it's much higher number than I had been thinking, but the HFA has put that forward. So that's aggressive. And if we're going to do anything close to that, I would hope that we do as much as we can that's affordable.
40,000 is a large number. And I'm juggling, our population in a stereotypical mode is declining. There's age gap, there's ages that are declining, but we've actually increased in the last census. I thought that 40,000 new homes would be necessary with a similar, I know we want to grow our population. I don't have anything intelligent to say about that except, wow, that's huge.
It's 5,000 a year,
Right, and how many did we do last year?
2,700. I think maybe you can't quote me on that, but you should double check that. That's what I read in the article this week.
Representative LeBounty.
Just again for clarification, we say 40,000 homes, you mean individual homes or condos? Or
Housing units.
Housing unit. So they could be 10,000 apartments would be considered
Yep.
part of that 40,000.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
I see shipping containers in our future.
A colleague of mine jokes that we've been building tiny homes for a lot of years. It's just we stacked them all up in one building. So
Well, isn't it like Kevin Costner said, if you build it, they will come? If we want to grow our economy, people are trying to come to Vermont, but there is no housing. So if we build it, they will come.
this is an assessment done by VHFA. You had Maura Collins in last week, so I'm sure if you wanted to dig into that number a little bit more, I'm sure she would.
So just to pump the brakes a little bit on the crisis.
Yep.
We're not the only state that's having a housing crisis. I read in any newspaper I get my hands on or online that this is I don't know if it's a universal problem, but it certainly is in this country where every state is dealing with rising real estate issues, lack of housing for the same populations that we're looking for. They actually have the same population issues. Demographics of losing, as was described yesterday, losing people between 25 and 35. I prefer to say that they aged out, but that idea that when starting out, there's not as many homes available for for less people than what we had 30 years ago is just sort of, we're not alone in this conversation. And whether or not people are having it in their own separate states is up to them. But I've read about California, I've read about North Carolina, I've read about Illinois. You know, it's everywhere. And so we're not unique in trying to solve the building and housing. But it's too easy to say 40,000 homes means that there's a 20,000, we need to create 20,000 more because 20,000 are going to fall down. It's easy to imagine, but it's not going to happen like that. It's really, if the net is 40,000, then, you know, we've got a lot of work to do.
I had the opportunity to spend a little time with Congresswoman Becca Balin yesterday, and she wants to be on the Financial Services Committee in DC, and I think she has a lot of competition because a lot of people around the country want to focus on the housing issue too. So, but it's true. It's not a Vermont isolated problem.
No, and the issues that come out of DC are really deep too. I mean, from changing the level of poverty calculations that haven't been changed in however many years, wages. But for us, we're hearing a lot about zoning, and you're based in, well, your service area is not only as urban as Vermont gets, but you also deal in a fairly rural area, or you have rural areas too. What are you finding in terms of the ability to do projects in areas that aren't, I mean, I would think that while Burlington has a set of rules that everybody can get used to, and they're fairly complex because they deal with the city, what are you finding in the rural communities that you're servicing?
We tend to work through the process okay. You know, I think we have relationships with municipalities, and we, you know, I know we're working in Shelburne right now. They have form-based code, so it's we haven't had things held up because of, you know, local regulations.
And is that because you know them?
I'm not sure. Maybe I should be knocking on wood. But you know, we have been building in conjunction with communities. Like, for example, the city of South Burlington is doing a new city center, and so we've been doing work there. The city of St. Albans wanted to invest in their downtown, and there's a great mixed use to mixed income development there. So I think we work closely with municipalities to accomplish the shared goals.
Representative Kreisen.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. So I was going to say similar to that, you know, we work really collaboratively, which is so nice. But I just want to, I don't know if now's the right time, but you were talking more about senior housing, and that it really, I know we need, you know, people who of our next generation, myself included, to have housing. It pains me that in South Burlington, which is a buzzing hub in Vermont, that there's, you know, 100 people wait lists for senior housing, affordable senior housing. And a couple of places, as I think I've mentioned earlier, have closed and for various reasons. So it was nice to hear you mention, so in St. Albans, that's what they're planning to, or would like to. Can you talk just touch base a little bit about what other senior places?
Cathedral Square just built in South Hero, the first senior housing in South Hero, or on Grand Isle, 15 years or something. They have an 84-person wait list after they filled their 30-something. I forget how many apartments are there. So they certainly are trying to fill that need, but it's just like, I mean, to some extent, you can think about our wait list as the number of people that are still in motels. You know, just broadly, there's, you know, if we think about that statewide, it takes 11 to 12 months from the time it's at Champlain Housing Trust when you fill out your application to when you get approved for, not approved, there's an apartment open for you. So we think about waitlist in terms of time too, not just the number of people. So we know, I mean, we don't need to belabor the need as much
Right.
anymore. We're really anxious to do the work and build the housing.
Thank you. Yeah, I just don't want to forget about the folks who are aging and who or want to stay aging in place and remain in their homes. But I live next door to an affordable senior community country park,
Okay.
and go over there a lot and talk to them, and just really, really a wonderful place. So more of that.
Yeah.
In my eyes. Thank you.
We heard testimony earlier from a couple different sources today, being Homelessness Awareness Day, about vouchers. 2010, the era of unfunding 1,000 Section 8 vouchers. Got a couple hundred funded over the course of 10 years, and then the pandemic hit, and then there's money all of a sudden for vouchers, which can't be issued because people can't find, people are in motels and they know they're not it's gonna take more than 120 days. Do you work, and I know there's lots of different levels of vouchers, I don't wanna make it seem like it's simple, but does CHT work with folks if you apply and it takes 11 to 12 months before an apartment comes available? Do you work with people within the 120 days and say, we think that you're gonna get this apartment in this amount of time, you should apply now so that you don't lose the voucher?
We may, if we are building in a certain community, for example, we have 34 apartments opening up in Williston. As a second part of a development. We are doing that outreach now to people that have said they're interested in living in Williston and saying, now's the time to make sure your application is ready, make sure you get, dot your T's, cross your I's, that kind of thing.
We also, we heard testimony about 30% of AMI. There's I don't remember what the number was, but there's a substantial number of people who are at 30% of AMI who do not have vouchers, who've been receiving VRAP money, which will be phased out by the end of June. Never mind people who accept vouchers, these are folks who are living where are they living? Just anecdotally, do you know, where are people who are at 30% of AMI living in Vermont? Maybe you can simply say mobile homes or whatnot, but they're obviously looking for apartments or need assistance at that level. Can you share any of your, not so much what CHT finds, but when you find people who are applying for apartments at that level, where are they living at?
Well, it is, not one simple answer to that, as you alluded to. There are some funding sources. One funding source that flows through VHCB is called the National Housing Trust Fund, which is a capital source, which we're supposed to set the rents at what people at 30% of AMI can afford. But that's a small number, it's only, I forget how much is coming in, 2 million a year or something to the state from this national source. So there'll be some apartments kind of sprinkled out throughout the portfolios of all the nonprofits that are funded through that people live in. But I think it's probably just those people are living around in your towns and, probably more rural areas than where the rents are a little lower. That's my guess. I can't say for sure.
Yes.
Outside of housing, when we talk about people who are experiencing homelessness, unhoused, included in that, is there an attempt to come up with a figure for those who are couch surfing with friends? Or are they missing from the equation?
Well, in the past, they had really been missing from that equation. And that's why we thought the point in time count that is done every year, it's being done next week, really missed a lot of people that we know were precariously housed or really weren't permanently housed. Over the last couple of years, though, with the pandemic and the loosening of some of the rules for use of the motels, and we had FEMA money to pay for that, we really have a better sense of what that population looked like. And that's why, at some level, that's why the numbers really have spiked in the last couple of years, is because we now know, like, oh, those are all those people that were living with family or bouncing from place to place.
So that spike in 2020 may be in part due to better counting,
Some of it, yep.
purely larger numbers.
The number I saw last week was, or maybe as early as this week, was there are only about not only, that's the wrong way to put it, but there are 150 people roughly that are unsheltered, that aren't in a homeless shelter or in a motel program or so forth in the state right now. They're living in the elements. And the other people are kind of have some place to be that they're not going to freeze. But that's a couple thousand people. And so that's why we think that we need to continue to keep the pipeline going, to build some permanent places for those people to live.
I appreciate you bringing that up because I wanted to point that out in the slide we saw today, is that the point in time count is, while there are people out on the street actually trying to count people, it's also estimates and anecdotal, and for as long as I've served, it's been in this 1,000 to 1,400 person range post and even pre recession or pre loss of funds for the Section 8. So there wasn't a direct correlation of loss of vouchers with the number of people who were being counted in the point in time count, but it came close. But yes, once people had to be inside, almost by order, it was a much more accurate count, and it was almost twice as much as what we had been estimating. Representative Lamont.
Thank you. I was just going to allude to that, and also just say that, and those numbers are still not accurate, and there's still people who do not disclose, seek services, or report that are not accounted for.
And they never will be accurate.
Exactly.
And, and the other thing that gets me is that when you think about 2,000 or 2,800 or whatever the number may be, I had somebody tell me a couple of years ago, there's a phrase that I find difficult to work with when you're talking about humans, but the phrase functional zero. And when you think of 150 people out of 640,000 people, or however many live in the state of Vermont, that we could just ignore them by saying it's functionally zero. I can't do that. I can't relegate people to invisibility based on a statistical model. But that's what we're up against sometimes. And I think it's less so than it was 10 years ago when it was even more invisible. I think the pandemic made this issue a lot more visible to people. But 2,700 people and 640,000 people is functionally zero. And but they're humans, and they're whatever word we use isn't really, I could say friends and neighbors. But I don't know anyone who's experiencing homelessness, so they're not my friends or neighbors. Anyway, it's almost for the committee's sake. That's what we're up against when we talk about, why do you want to spend this much money on this problem? Aren't you almost there? And I'm like, that's like a plumber, or me telling my wife, yes, I plumbed my sink and it's only dripping a little bit. Isn't that okay? And the answer is no, it's not. It has to be, it has to be complete. All right, any further questions before we ask Gus or Polly or both to come forward to?
I have
have one question,
Yes.
and I don't know if you're the right person to ask. I should say that first. So maybe just a general question. But this morning, Sarah Phillips said, and I heard her say the other day as well, that that they have helped 3,000 people get into permanent housing in the last year.
Last 2 years.
I wondered whether any of that was using the VRAP money and whether the payments for those are going to continue. Do you know?
Certainly people that have moved into rental housing in the last few years have had assistance through the VRAP program. I don't know the number of people that are more recent tenants that have received that, but certainly some of those people have benefited from the VRAP program.
Part of the VRAP program was to provide first, last, and security for some folks. So it could have been people who were experiencing homelessness. It could have been people who were needing to move from one place to another, and then on top of that, received rental assistance, but
Utilities as well.
in utilities. I'm not sure what we can check in with the the SHA again, or go to their website and see if there's numbers they have. I'm sure they have it broken down to a degree, but we certainly spent less money on first, last, and security than we have on just pure rental assistance.
VRAP has also paid for some housing stability services that are delivered through organizations like mine that are able to provide support for people to access either other programs or just guidance, and counseling and stuff.
We, Representative LeBounty and I were out on the front steps just for the Washington County commemoration of today, of the Homelessness Awareness Day, and there was a local advocate who we've known for years, I've known for years and years and years, who just talked about pathways. I don't think we've talked about pathways, but you've heard Housing First as a model. We'll have pathways, and they're not the only organization that does the Housing First model. Washington County Mental Health has several units that they keep available. I think you have a Housing First model, which is simply taking people where they are, being able to put them into an apartment with a bed and sheets and dishes and services to help them sustain living in an apartment, in a home. And Pathways is not the only place that does it, but it is. And it's only in 6 or 7 counties right now. And so that's going to be a consideration for us to go down the budgeting road, where we're not necessarily going to do any legislation, but we'll hear testimony from them about their work and what they're looking for in terms of being a statewide organization and how they might work with other, or how they complement the work. Do you have a question? Sorry, did you have your hand up? I made believe. Okay. All right. Thank you, Chris. We'll see you next week with your boss and for more in-depth dive into CHT.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Gus, can you join us? Welcome back.
Thank you.
So, you've heard Chris's testimony. I was looking from, one of the things about the BAA is we have to write this memo that suggests, whether it suggests a number or not, I think the first thing we've noticed is that there's no money for housing in this particular, there's no extra money for housing in this particular budget. And maybe it's a review of what you said last week, but I was wondering if you could just let us know what the importance is of having funds available for developers over the next 6 months. Because I think you posted a slide that said you've expended this much money. And then there's other money that is not as much.
Okay, so I'll review a few things, and I'll just want to be very clear that Governor Scott, since he came into office and proposed a housing revenue bond, has been very supportive of our work together and has been supportive of housing. And we want to continue to work very closely with the administration. We will know tomorrow what his budget for the year is, and what part housing will play in that. And, so we may be a little bit early today to talk about that. Having said that, what the General Assembly has done the last 2 years I believe in the Budget Adjustment Act has been to appropriate some funds for housing. I think that's in part in response to what I described as a humanitarian crisis that COVID made much worse in terms of people having no permanent housing. I think to go to the question somebody asked about people being doubled up, I think part of what happened in COVID was if you were letting somebody couch surf in your house and all of a sudden every medical expert in the world said social distancing was important long before we had vaccines, probably people who had a place to couch surf didn't any longer. And as great a work as we've done getting people permanently housed since the last number I heard was 2,800 households had been permanently housed. So if we're up to 3,000, that's progress over the last couple months. But there's still more than, I think, about 1,700 families. I got those numbers from Sarah Phillips the other day. Or households and many hundreds of children still living in motels or other places that are not permanent housing. So we still have a big job ahead of us over the coming years. And as much as you work on policy and zoning, what I can tell you is for what I called the essential workforce when I was in here before, or people with disabilities, housing has become so expensive that without a public investment, we will not get the price down to a place where they can afford it. That's essentially what we do with public funds, is to bring the price down because it costs too much. I think one of you commented that some of the workforce was busy building a $6 million house in somebody's district. And that's what we're competing against, and why part of why costs are skyrocketing. So the other slide I showed you was that we have a pipeline, and I think it's more than a pipe dream, but not shovel ready, of close to 2,000 units that would need something in the order of $185 million from us and other public sources in order to make work, including the tax credit. It takes a long time to get a housing project from an idea to design to permitting to bidding to construction. What the General Assembly has done the last couple of years has been to basically say, we have a crisis, we're going to spend some money on it as quickly as we can. Whether you do that in the BAA or the governor has a recommendation, tomorrow we will work with you to make programs work as quickly and effectively as we can. There's a whole host of housing need that goes to just increasing the supply writ large in home ownership and rental housing. There was a time when I was young that people used to build 1,200 square foot capes or ranches, individual guys and or small businesses, and that's kind of stopped. And I think there's so much of a profit margin in building 3,000 square foot homes or 4,000 square foot homes that, and a much smaller building industry in Vermont today, that's where people go, is where they can make the most money. There's more profit in an SUV than there is in a Ford Escort. I think we need public intervention to build the modestly sized homes. There are a whole range of needs that go to manufactured home communities. Last year, you provided funding for some pilots, and we don't yet have a proposal anywhere in the state, but you had a parents group for parents of intellectually disabled folks wanting places for their kids to go when they can no longer take care of them, adult kids. We talked about funding for recovery residences. We will need more of them to address the opioid epidemic. I think as we wind down the emergency housing program, as it's been known in subsidized motels, we will have more requests for single room occupancies, for what we call permanent supportive housing, for people who are unhoused now, experiencing homelessness, and really need a lot of support services. We began a program last year and this was partially an equity issue, to address the needs of farm workers, and that is underway. That's a program that could and should grow. We support a program at the Vermont Center for Independent Living to help people stay in their homes by providing bathroom modifications, kitchen modifications, and ramps when they reach the point in their lives where their mobility is impaired. And again, the largest issue is just increasing the supply of home ownership and rental housing at the lower end of the spectrum, which we are constrained on. So however you choose to attack that issue in the BAA or the big bill, we will be ready to put those dollars to work. To be precise, we expect if our board approves the staff recommendations next week, we will have spent over $200 million in one-time funding or committed it. Won't all be out the door. We'll have about $37 million left to go for our March, May, and June board meetings. We think we have more than enough applications to spend that. We may leave some projects to the side of the road and not have the resources to commit until there's more funding. But I can't say that for sure till the applications actually come in and are underwritten. But based on what we know, we're at the end of the time of these dollars. And Mr. Chairman, you'll recall that when you made these commitments, nobody expected that we'd be able to move this quickly. I think it's really starting with the first $33 million, that was a sprint because the feds gave us a 9-month deadline. So when you talk about sending a signal, it really is true that developers will respond to what they think can happen. And if they think there aren't going to be the resources, they won't spend money on architects and engineering and dealing with their communities over permitting. I guess the last thing I would say is there's a range of things that are in our pipeline. And as I get around the state and talk to people, there are things that are not yet in our pipeline. So some of you may know that there's a parcel of land in Brattleboro where the Austin School used to be, and a wonderful nonprofit that's taken ownership of it and filled all the old buildings there. But they have a lot of land and they've got water and sewer. And she was on the news the other day and she's had everybody in state government having anything to do with development down. And she's got a vision for a 300 home neighborhood there. That's not in our pipeline yet. I think it's more than a pipe dream. I think it'll take quite a while to pull together the resources to build 300 homes. But I could see that within a year or so, we could build the first 30 homes and then the next 30 homes and a mix of different types from rental housing to condominiums and so on. So there are things out there that are not yet in the pipeline, but that Vermonters are thinking about. Been a long discussion of that site in St. Johnsbury where there was a fire a few years back. Rural Edge has applied, I think, for a program that's very slow moving called HUD 202 to put elder housing there. That's probably not in our pipeline now, but if HUD were to say yes, we'd want to jump on it. In your district, I don't know if it'll ever come to pass, but I think that if the state ever decided it's time to decommission the Windsor prison, that's adjacent to a residential neighborhood. There's water and sewer there. Those old buildings need to come down. The wire fence needs to come down, but you could build a great neighborhood there, I think. So there's a lot of opportunity across the state.
Think you could get a premium for a house with a watchtower?
I don't know. Might depend on who the buyer is.
Gus, if you drove across the state, if you were like gonna do a town to town or, 251 club kind of touched base with all the towns or vicinities in the state. Could you envision 40,000 new homes or units?
So this is something I think I said to you at the orientation session when, maybe I didn't, when Howard Dean gave his farewell address. He said if Vermont wanted to grow smart, it was going to have to figure out how to grow vertically if we didn't want to really screw up the countryside. 40,000 homes is another Burlington, right? Or actually more than another Burlington, because there's 40,000 people live in Burlington, probably not 40,000 homes. I have trouble envisioning that. I don't know if that's the right number. I want to hear more from Maura. When we talked about that, what the number was a few weeks ago, we were talking about 10,000 units in the next 4 years. What I can tell you is that the Vermont Business, in their most recent edition, reported that Vermont has the highest rate of in-migration in the country for the second year in a row, as opposed to out-migration. Okay, so net, we're bringing in, more people are coming here than are leaving by the largest margin, 2 years in a row of any state in the country. There was a climate report a few weeks ago, and Representative Lamont, they said Lamoille County was the #1 destination for climate migrants of any place in the country. But what Vermont Business also reported is we're not getting young 25-year-olds with no assets. We're getting people who are mid-career or retired. And that means they're coming here with assets. And that's part of what we've seen is that people, if you sold a house in New York, Boston, or San Francisco, you're coming here with assets that let you make those full price, above price cash offers that Vermonters can't compete with. The people who are here, again, doing the hard work that so many people do that make our lives work well, what I call the essential workforce. So I don't know if that'll continue at the same rate. And I think we do have to welcome new people and welcome their talents. And I hope if they're coming at the point in their life where they can be philanthropists, that's wonderful too. But we got to figure out how to build the more modest housing that people who are working at the supermarket and fixing our cars and plowing our roads will need.
Representative Tangerman, Preston.
This is tangential to you talking about building up.
Yeah.
But I recently saw a figure about the number of acres in Vermont of farmland lost to development every year, or it said number of acres of farmland lost. And then the assumption was that it was to development. And I was wondering if also have a lot of farmland that's going back to forest. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas on how much land is being used from, is most building happening in already settled areas?
I don't think we're getting the kind of spaghetti lot development that Harry Patton was practicing back in the 1980s.
Can you define that?
Back then, there was what was called the 10-acre loophole. And so people would take a parcel of land and develop 9 10-acre lots to avoid Act 250. And they were, long, skinny, narrow lots with just enough frontage to satisfy zoning and enough to be out of permitting. And I think we've probably closed that loophole. And this fellow, Harry Patton, did it all over the state. And you can see it on land use maps. And so what it did from an agricultural perspective in a place like Addison County is took a lot of land out of production, way more than most people would want to have to mow. 10 acres is a lot of mowing. There is clearly, and this is a part of our work, great strain in the ag sector today. What I can tell you in terms of the conserved land base is The Vermont Land Trust, our primary partner in conserving land, has to make us visit every farm every 2 years and monitor it, at least aerially in between, is that every bit of conserved land, which is much less than the whole ag base of the state of Vermont, which is over 1 million acres, is being farmed to some degree or another, meaning it's at least being hayed, some of it's being cropped. There's clearly been consolidation. There is new strain because what was for a long, long time a great way to do business in terms of organic dairy is now under huge amount of pressure because costs of gasoline and feed have gone up so much and the price of milk, organic milk, has not gone up to compensate farmers, and they tend not to have the kind of scale that the larger operators do. So we've seen a lot of consolidation of ag ownership in the state, but I would have to talk to the ag agency about farmland being lost to production. I know the conserve base is being actively used, but I don't know. I don't think we're seeing a loss to development in the same way we were back in the 80s and early 90s. There may be more large lot development for people who can afford to do that kind of development.
Thank you. Representative President?
I also wanted to bring to attention the rental, in my development. I live in a condo development in South Burlington. I've been there 17 years, so I've seen some flow, but a lot of the snowbirds are coming back now because it's warmer. And so those are the rental market in South Burlington is like, not just because of that, but all the reasons. But I'm just, I've noticed a lot of older folks coming back now who had those as rentals while they were gone in Florida and for a variety of reasons have come back. And I just didn't know with the rental, if there's any suggestions or.
Well, I think South Burlington did a great job in establishing the new town center. We've funded 2 buildings there. And I think that's been a real success story in terms of housing development in recent years, is communities taking on that challenge. So St. Albans has created a TIF district.
Yeah.
Chris's organization and a private developers teamed up for probably a total of 60 to 80 units right across from City Hall. There are 2 more projects planned not far away from there as part of their TIF district. The first one's could probably add 150 units, and then there's the 33 units with Cathedral Square. City of Montpelier just purchased the old golf course at the Elks and has promised the community some of that. I think the way they sold it to the voters to bond was that some of that was going to get used for housing. Representative of the Chair's district just voted in favor of providing a lot for affordable housing. So there, I think everybody's looking for opportunities. I think the designation programs have helped a lot in putting housing in the right kinds of places so that we don't just sprawl out into the countryside and have concentrated development and walkable neighborhoods and that kind of thing. But rural communities need help too. And, I was on a community visit up in Montgomery with the Council on Rural Development probably about 5 years ago, and they are now getting ready to get funding to build a sewage system. And I'm sure, again, something not in our pipeline, but housing was an issue for Montgomery back then. I'm sure at some point, once they have a public sewer system, they're going to say, okay, we're ready for some housing development in our village and we can accommodate it now. So I think we're going to see more in that. There's a lot of money that will flow in over the next 5 years from the bipartisan infrastructure bill to support water and sewer. And I think I said this in my testimony last week, that I hope that some of that can be used to support housing development. And I hope that means we'll get the dollars, given the governor's speech last week on the needs of small towns and rural communities, that will get some of those dollars out to rural communities, which will make it much easier for any housing developer to do their work if we can reduce their costs by not having to do very expensive on-site septic systems.
Now, I don't want to imply that you've been doing this job for a couple hundred years,
Yeah, I am long in the tooth. Thank you.
Thinking about infrastructure, way back when towns were being laid out in whatever fashion, I mean, some of them were just laid out as the cows walked.
He was here then.
I can say that when I rented my first house in North Callis and I drove across down, there was at least two farmers cows were crossing the road from one side to the next. That's changed, but in Callis, that doesn't happen
Sorry,
anymore.
that's okay.
So I am that old.
He was just, no, Senator Doyle was still here.
yeah.
So, that when towns were being laid out, with putting in their sewer systems, like the Waterbury Village. You know, it got thicker because there was water and sewer. Who paid for that? I mean, was there federal or state help to lay out towns when they first started, or was it all just based on the towns deciding that they wanted it and they had to bond for it, or however they did it in the 19th century?
Well,
Do you
I don't know that,
history?
I don't know that we had I don't know when we had our first public sewer systems. I mean, I think we had, so, no, I don't know that piece of land use history. I know some land use experts who might have the answer to that question, but I
For
don't.
telephones, or electric lines, so much of that was federally based, right? Or a good chunk of it was federally based. But anyway, it's a question, so if we're gonna ask for infrastructure money to help lower the cost of a developer's cost of building houses, what does it take? Is it the municipality's decision to raise 20 or 30 or 40 million dollars, whatever it would cost, to build a system that was state of the art?
Yeah, this isn't beyond my expertise, but I would go look at what they're planning to do in Montgomery as at least one example of how are they going to put the dollars together to have a public sewer system. And my guess is there's some bonding and there's some granting of federal funds involved in making it happen.
Okay. Any further questions for Gus right now? All right, committee, let's take a break till 20 past, and then we'll spend about a half an hour kind of chewing over what we heard. I also want to, were you able to meet and learn about the GA money?
Sort of.
Okay.
So how long have you been here then? Let's hear.
I've been doing this job since 1987.
All right, I was 2. So, thank you.
Yeah, so was